Hello and welcome back to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine Celiac, RN, BSN, CEN. And today, during episode 61, I am going to talk about celiac disease in the U.S. military. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'm still Nadine Celiac, and today during episode 61, I am going to talk about celiac disease in the U.S. military and why it's so important to know a little bit about that. Because we all know people in the military, whether we have family members or friends, neighbors, we all know someone in the military or someone that has served the United States in either the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, Army, Coast Guard, or the National Guard. It is important to know about celiac disease and the military because there are several issues that you really do need to be aware of. Interestingly enough, if you have celiac disease, you are disqualified from enlisting in any branch of the military. The military will not accept you as an enlistee into any branch of the service due to the fact that you have celiac disease. The primary reason for this is because they are unable to provide safe food for a celiac patient or a celiac person that is serving in the military. MREs, or meals ready to eat, are not gluten-free, and at this point in history, there are no accommodations made for people with celiac disease in the military. I am aware that there are some people in the military that do have celiac disease, but they are typically the people that will not be deployed. They would not be sent overseas. They would not be sent on a mission anywhere else other than in an office. And quite frankly, I know relatively little about the inside workings of the military, but the research that I've gathered for this episode of the Gluten Free RN podcast leads me to believe that if you are found out to have celiac disease and do not disclose that you have celiac disease, that you will be discharged. And I'm just going to read this one little chunk from military.com. It's 2 paragraphs, and it says, below you will find details from the Army's standard of medical fitness. These standards generally apply to all other branches as well. Remember that most of these conditions are not necessarily permanently disqualifying, but they are red flags. If you have had a medical complication at any time in your life that is mentioned here, then you need to tell your recruiter. They will tell you whether your condition can be waived or if it is permanently disqualifying. Remember that if you do not get an official waiver and your condition is later discovered, you will most likely be dishonorably discharged for fraudulent enlistment. The choice is yours. So that is just the paragraph that begins 26 pages, which I've referenced in the podcast notes, of conditions that are disqualifying for people to be in the military. And interestingly enough, the first page of that has abdominal organs and gastrointestinal system. So these would be causes for rejection for appointment, enlistment, and induction if there is an authenticated history of any ulceration, varices, fistula, achalasia, or any other dysmotility disorders, chronic or recurrent esophagitis, gastritis, active ulcer, congenital abnormalities of the stomach or duodenum, inflammatory bowel disease or IBD, ulcerative colitis, ulcerative proctitis, duodenal diverticulae with symptoms or sequelae, such as hemorrhage or perforation, intestinal malabsorption syndromes, including post-surgical and idiopathic. And I have to believe that's where celiac disease would officially fit into. But of course, many people with celiac disease have a myriad of presenting signs and symptoms that would most likely also disqualify them from serving in the military. One of the reasons that this became a recommended topic for the podcast is that there was a young man that wanted to serve in the military and he wanted to go on to be trained to be a fighter pilot. Upon the initial physical health screening, he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Interestingly, he was not tested for celiac disease by the military doctors, but was subsequently diagnosed with celiac disease also. So he was not able to serve in the military as he had planned as a high school student. It was his dream to serve in the military and to be a fighter pilot. But because of the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes, he was disqualified. And also the subsequent diagnosis of celiac disease would have prevented him from being admitted into the military also. Of course, this does not mean that he is not able to go on to college or any other lofty goal that he sets for himself, because obviously this particular person is very motivated and sets high goals for himself. So of course he's going to be successful in life despite the fact that he has type 1 diabetes and also celiac disease. He will manage both of those really well and maintain his health. Of course, he found out at a young age that he has type 1 diabetes and celiac disease, but he has a loving family and medical people that are knowledgeable about celiac disease and type 1 diabetes supporting him in every way. So while his diagnoses prevented him from serving in the U.S. military, he will go on to be a very successful adult, no doubt. I know this young man, and he is phenomenal. His entire family is celiac, by the way, and they are very supportive of each other. But interestingly enough, it appears that the military doctors do not test for celiac disease in general. They do not perform any of the tests that would actually indicate that a person that is applying to enlist in the military actually has celiac disease. So they don't test for it, but if it does show up later while somebody is serving in the military, they will be medically discharged from the military. Again, because they're not deployable. It means they cannot be sent on a mission or overseas or anywhere that they would be put in danger because they could not get food. Let's just say the military, even if they were providing gluten-free food for soldiers that did have celiac disease, what if those packages of gluten-free food did not arrive in time? We can't have people that don't have access to safe food serving in the military, and that does make sense. I understand it, and if I was in the military, of course, I would hope that I would be reassigned so that I could continue to be in the military, to continue to serve. But if I was discharged for a medical reason, this sounds like it would be a reasonable reason to be discharged from the military for a medical reason. People with peanut allergies or other food allergies are not allowed to serve in the military either. The military makes no accommodations for people with food allergies or food intolerances. The Department of Defense is the regulating body for this, so if you have any questions, I would direct them into the Department of Defense. There are other countries that do allow people with celiac disease to serve in their military. This would be Israel, Finland, and in Scandinavia. You can serve in the military if you have celiac disease. Apparently, accommodations will be made. I've also included in the podcast notes an article entitled The Incidence and Risk of Celiac Disease in a Healthy U.S. Adult Population. The authors of this article are Riddle, Murray, and Porter, so you can reference this and perhaps read along. The abstract states that celiac disease is an increasingly common disease that may affect as many as 1% of the North American population. Recent population-based data suggest a substantial increase in the prevalence of CD or celiac disease over the last several decades. Several factors are hypothesized as possible disease triggers, including intercurrent illnesses such as gastroenteritis, surgeries, and trauma. We use the active duty U.S. military, a unique healthy worker population with essentially complete medical diagnostic coding, as an opportunity to describe trends in celiac disease and deployment-related risk factors. So they had a large study population of course, and the results showed a total of 455 incident cases of celiac disease. I am not quite sure how they actually tested for celiac disease. I'll go back and look at that. And I'm sure they missed people if out of a population of 13.7 million person years, they only found a total of 455 incident cases of celiac disease that were identified and age, gender, and time matched to 1,820 controls. The incidence of celiac disease increased fivefold from 1.3 per 100,000 in 1999 to 6.5 per 100,000 in 2008. This particular article is from the American Journal of Gastroenterology from 2012. And it also states with the highest rates of increase among those over 34 years of age, average annual increase of 0.8 cases per 100,000. A total of 172 IgE episodes, predominantly of viral etiology, were documented. Risk generally increased with temporal proximity to and non-viral etiology of exposure. Other notable risk factors for celiac disease in multivariate models were Caucasian race, non-army service, and greater than high school education. The conclusions state, incidence of celiac disease diagnosis in the U.S. military is increasing, particularly among those in the 4th and 5th decades of life, and appears higher than other population-based estimates. An association between incident IgE and risk of celiac disease was noted, but the potential for exposure misclassification cannot be ruled out, and further study is needed to link pathogen-specific exposure to celiac disease, anti-gluten antibody development, or symptom onset. This is from the discussion portion of this article. This study demonstrates a substantial increase incidence and diagnosis rate of celiac disease in a large, generally healthy young adult population for which there is excellent capture of diagnosis and ready access to healthcare. This rise in incidence is consistent with what has been reported in other Western industrialized population-based studies and likely represents a combination of both increased diagnoses due to increased suspicion, but also may reflect a true increase in incidence, possibly related to environmental changes in cereal processing, including wheat genetics, interesting, keep that in mind, bread processing, and enzymatic modification of wheat prolamines resulting from changes in industry processes. It is interesting that this increase in incidence seemed to be more marked in individuals in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th decades of life, among those who would have already been in the military service for many years, suggesting that this is a true new onset of disease or the emergence of long-standing silent disease. We did not have data available and secular trends for number of serological celiac disease tests performed, which should be done to inform the potential bias associated with increased testing that could partially explain the increased incidence. So really, they did not test initially for celiac disease, is what I'm getting from that. Upon enlisting in the military, people are not tested for celiac disease. So this is when they've been in the military for a number of years, and they're already in their 30s, 40s, 50s, that they're showing signs of celiac disease or being tested appropriately for celiac disease. I am also not aware if the military tests for any genetic studies. It would be interesting to find out if they did. So if you have access to that information as far as does the military actually test for the HLA DQ2 and or DQ8 genes? Are they doing genetic testing on people when they enter the military, any branch? So if you have that information, if you wouldn't mind passing it along, that would be very helpful. I would love to be able to include that in a future podcast. And what other questions do you have about celiac disease in the military? So we know that people with celiac disease with known celiac disease cannot be admitted into the military. We also know that people with celiac disease that are already in the military that get a diagnosis while they are active members, they will be discharged from the military for medical reasons. It would be very difficult to be in the military and also have celiac disease. We all know, even with the best resources, It is very difficult to prevent cross-contamination or contamination outright with wheat, barley, rye, and oats, mostly because gluten is in so many products and is everywhere. So if you're preparing food in a mess hall and the vast majority of the food that you are producing or processing contains wheat, it would be very difficult to have a separate area in a mess hall or in a food preparation area that would be separate, that you could safely process gluten-free food without cross-contamination. It would be very difficult. You would almost have to have your own chef if you were in the military and expecting to have gluten-free food prepared for you. Now, I say all this knowing that people with celiac disease are protected under the American with Disabilities Act, under the ADA. I also know there are separate and different rules for the military. I do have another abstract that I'm including in the podcast notes. It's entitled Celiac Sprue Among U.S. Military Veterans, Associated Disorders and Clinical Manifestations. The authors of this article would be Delco and team. The present study aimed to describe the clinical manifestations of celiac sprue, which of course we don't use that term anymore. And this is from 1999. Celiac sprue related to malnutrition, and to analyze the associations between celiac sprue and other diagnoses. A case control study compared the occurrence of comorbid diagnoses in case and control subjects with and without celiac, respectively. All patients with a primary or secondary diagnosis of celiac disease, which at the time was ICD-579, who were discharged from hospitals of the Department of Veterans Affairs between 1986 and 1995, were selected as case subjects. In a multivariate logistic regression analysis, the occurrence of celiac disease served as outcome variable, while age, gender, ethnicity, and the comorbid occurrences of other diagnoses served as predictor variables. A total of 458 individual patients with celiac were identified. The data confirmed the known associations of celiac disease with dermatitis herpetiformis, lactase deficiency, enlargements of lymph nodes, and lymphoma. Celiac sprue was also found to be statistically significantly associated with pancreatic insufficiency, Crohn's disease, functional bowel syndromes, chronic non-alcoholic hepatitis, there's that NASH again, and pulmonary eosinophilia. The nutritional manifestations associated with celiac disease included nutritional marasmus, which is essentially starving, or is a condition of chronic undernourishment. It's noted that it typically occurs in children, but of course we see that in adults also. And if a veteran is perhaps an alcoholic, we most assuredly typically will see malnutrition in patients that are alcoholic. Cachexia, weight loss, hypocalcemia, osteoporosis, vitamin B complex deficiencies, and various types of iron and vitamin deficiency anemias. The large variety of complex associations clearly indicate that celiac is a systemic disease that involves multiple organs and exceeds an isolated nutritional intolerance to gluten. There's a lot of information in there, but basically it says that there are many different ways that people are presenting with celiac disease. They are potentially getting these other diagnoses, but not always being tested for celiac disease. So they presented with many other medical issues. They received diagnoses, but then when they were tested for celiac disease, the test for celiac disease actually came back positive. So another great reason for practitioners, whether you work for the VA, you're a nurse, you're a doctor, a nurse practitioner, a PA, whatever your way that you work as a healthcare provider or a primary care provider, that you are always keeping celiac disease on your differential diagnoses so that you can pick these people up early and potentially prevent any further organ damage or medical sequelae that would occur when people are undiagnosed with celiac disease, and therefore they just don't know that they need to be on a gluten-free diet. A gluten-free diet, of course, can be very preventative for many other autoimmune diseases, nutritional deficiencies, cancers such as lymphoma or bowel cancer. So it is really important to identify people either before they go into the military. So this would be a great test for the military medical doctors to add to the myriad of testing that they're doing for people that are enlisting in the military. I'm not quite sure why people are not tested for celiac disease when they enlist. But again, that would be a great test to include in the medical testing before a person ends up in the military. Considering the fact that up to 50% of the population would say they were perfectly healthy, they had no symptoms, but they do in fact have villus atrophy or blunting of their villi and inflammation of their duodenum, jejunum, ileum. And it's really hard to see that from the outside in. So there is very specific testing for those antibodies. So people should have that testing before they go into the military. And I would highly recommend that, the military has somewhat of an obligation to test people before they go into the military for celiac disease specific, especially if the military is noting that the rate of celiac disease or the incidence and the prevalence is increasing all of the time. That would be another reason to have the testing done on people that are looking to join a branch of the military. I'm hoping that this episode has addressed some of your issues or concerns about joining the military, especially if you're interested in that. Also, I would suggest that if you do have plans to join the military, find out your genetic status. Find out if you are at risk of developing celiac disease, because as noted in many of these studies, people don't develop overt signs or symptoms of celiac disease or end up with a positive antibody test until they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And at that point, then you will be medically discharged from the military. Now, if you're a gene carrier and you're never exposed to gluten or the proteins in wheat, barley, rye, or oats, then you won't develop celiac disease or any of the medical sequelae that goes along with that. So it's a good idea to know this information. It's a good idea to be informed so that you can make educated decisions about your future. If you have any comments or questions or concerns, please feel free to send me an email at nadine@glutenfreern.com, which is also in the podcast notes. And if you like this episode, please leave a rating and a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'd like to make a shout out to all the people in the U.S. military. Thank you very much for providing your service in keeping us safe here in the United States. And of course, I always find this is a fascinating topic regarding the politics of celiac disease. This is where I would put this particular topic. So thank you very much for joining me for episode 61 of the Gluten Free RN podcast. We've talked about many factors about celiac disease in the military. I hope this has been very helpful for you to review some of this information. If it's the first time you've heard this information, I hope it makes sense, and I hope that you have more information to make educated decisions about your health, your family's health, and you realize that even though you can't get in the military with a diagnosis of celiac disease, there's many, many other things that you could potentially do with your life that are equally or even more satisfying for you and don't put you at risk for contamination or cross-contamination with gluten. So you maintain your health. And that is what this is all about. And this is just a reminder for those of you that this might be your first episode. If you think celiac disease does not affect you, your family, and your friends, think again. Celiac disease is everywhere. It's in the military. It's in your neighbors. It's at your coworkers are probably affected, whether they know it or not. So have a high index of suspicion for people that are having a hard time finding a diagnosis or are frustrated. Always suggest a test for celiac disease, especially if things don't make sense medically. There you have it, episode 61, Celiac Disease in the Military. I'm Nadine Gruskowiak, the Gluten Free RN. Thanks again for joining me. It's always great to research new topics and to deliver them via this podcast. Again, please feel free to leave a rating or a review on Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you listen to this podcast. And thanks again for joining me, Nadine Gruskowiak, the Gluten Free RN. Bye.